Welcome everybody to this hybrid event, which is part of the activities of the PhD program in Legal Sciences of the University of Pisa, Department of Laws. My name is Vincenzo Troiano, and I am the Vice President of the Italian Association of Economic Law Academy. I bring you greetings from Professor Michela Pastalacqua, who is the organizer of this event, and she's the scientific director of the curriculum in administration, marketing, criminal justice of the PhD program. Michela cannot be here in person as she's about to give birth, and we wish her the best. Today, we have the opportunity to listen to a lecture magistralis titled Nudge, the Final Edition, a topic of great interest amongst the other to jurists, economists, regulators, and I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein from Harvard Law School. Cass will be well known to all of you. He's the most cited American legal scholar and an exemplary practitioner of interdisciplinary research, drawing on fields such as regulatory and constitutional law, behavioral economics, environmental law, philosophy, among. He has written on countless topics. In his research on risk regulation, he is known for developing, together with Timur Curran, the concept of availability cascade and the popular discussion of an idea that is self-feeding and causes individuals to overweight its importance. Along with Richard Taylor, he has elaborated the nudge theory in regulatory policy, developing that idea within a framework that they describe as libertarian paternalism. In 2018, he was awarded the Olber Prize for having reshaped our understanding of the relationship between the modern regulatory state and constitutional law. In addition to all those academic accomplishments, Cass is a very prominent figure in American public life. Just to give you an example, he headed the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Obama administration. Moving to the themes of the nudge, the subtitle of the first edition of Nudge in 2008 was Improving Decision about Health, Wealth, and Happiness, and identified the program of the new theoretical approach. Nudge discusses how public and private organizations can help people make better choices in their daily life. The main theme of nudge is that humans are not always rational decision makers. Instead, they are influenced by a variety of cognitive biases and heuristics that can lead us to make choices that are not in our best interest. Here comes the central concept of libertarian paternalism. The idea is that by understanding these biases and designing interventions that are based on them, it is possible to nudge people toward making better decisions while still respecting their individual preferences and freedom of choice, and thus recognize that people value their autonomy and do not want to be forced to do anything. In other words, it is possible, according to their theory, that to be somehow both libertarian and paternalistic at the same time. A great relevance is paid to the default options, used as anchoring tool, having in mind that inertia is a very powerful force. Famous is the example of the use of default options in retirement saving plans. It is clear that most crucial point is how to set such a default, and the example of the tipping behavior in taxi cabs is very effective in this respect. Another seminal concept is choice architecture, which refers to the way choices are presented to people. By adjusting the choice architecture in subtle ways, such as by changing the default option or using social norms to encourage certain behaviors, we can nudge people towards making better decisions without restricting their freedom of choice. Transparency and accountability are of essence in nudging. It is necessary for people to understand why they are being nudged and to have the ability to opt out if they choose. The 2021 final edition of the Nudge includes a very stimulating new chapter, the Complaints Department. Here, the more relevant criticism made over the year to various aspects of the nudge theory are discussed. It is underlined that the proposed paternalism is a paternalism of means and not of ends. And there is not a trade-off between nudging and educating, but they may work together. As far as regard the criticism that nudge may be result in being manipulative, it is the author reply that the definition of manipulation is questionable, and in any case, sludges rather than nudges are manipulative. I could continue as these aspects are very intriguing, but we will discuss them later. Indeed, I am delighted to announce that there will be a Q&A session following the lecture by Cass. 4 discussants will take part to the Q&A session. Tamara Favaro and Donato Vese, assistant professor in economic law at the University of Pisa. Bruno Brancati, assistant professor in constitutional law at the same university. All of them have devoted particular interest to the relationship between state intervention and market regulation. Today, they will focus on some aspect of nudge in this regard. So they are ideal contributors for this event. Finally, Nicola Petrucco, a PhD candidate in administrative law, will also help us to delve into today's subject during the intra-discussion with Cass. But now, let me invite Cass to tell us more about nudge. Cass, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be able to speak to you, and I'm honored by that extremely kind introduction. I have some relevant news, which is based on data. So this is not anecdotal news, it's data news. And it's that there's a survey I've been involved with on European attitudes toward nudges. And one bit of the survey involved 6 European nations, diverse European nations. And in all of them, nudges received widespread approval. But there's one nation which was the most enthusiastic about nudges, and the nation is Italy. Italy is the European champion in terms of enthusiasm for nudges, though this is in 6 nations where all of them approve of nudges. Okay, what you just heard is the preface to a little book which I've written for you. It's not a very long book. It has 4 chapters. The chapters are called Humanity. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called Nudges. Chapter 3 is called Feast, F-E-A-S-T, and I'm not going to eat or offer you the hamburgers that I might have cooked if I were present there, but I'm going to give you an acronym, F-E-A-S-T, which is designed to capture approximately 4 decades of work on behavioral economics and nudging. And chapter 4 is called Sludge, which is the one about which I am most enthusiastic. It's relevant to policy as well as to humanity. And with that introduction, 4 chapters: Humanity, Nudges, Feast, and Sludge. For Humanity, I have to tell you a little story, which is the origin story for nudging. A number of years ago, and this is a true story, there were 2 social scientists who were widely known throughout the world, the academic world, to be extraordinary. And the more famous of the 2 was named Amos Tversky. And I remember a time when there was an intelligence test thought to be very accurate, which was how long after meeting Amos Tversky do you realize that he's smarter than you are? If you realize that quickly, you're really smart. If it takes you 5 or 10 minutes, you're not quite as smart as you would otherwise be. And Amos Tversky was not only brilliant, he was funny, he was charismatic. He was the sort of person who, when he entered a room, it was like there was a light over him and everyone looked at him. He was also immensely confident. He was sure of himself. The other great social scientist you've probably heard of is Daniel Kahneman, who was at the same university with Tversky. And to the people who knew Tversky and Kahneman, the question was what would happen when they actually met. they were both so brilliant, perhaps the universe would explode, perhaps there would be some sort of ignition that would be noticed by everyone within the country where they happened to meet. Kahneman invited Tversky to his seminar. This is where they first really met. And Tversky gave a paper on rationality, in which Tversky, who was then a mathematical psychologist, urged that people rationally update when they receive new information, so that people are good Bayesians, in the sense that if you think, for example, that the risk of a pandemic is very low, and then you hear about something happening in China, you will update in real time and your probability assessment will change accordingly. And Tversky gave, as he always did, an extraordinary and dazzling performance, full of humor and evidence and charisma, and everyone was dazzled by it. And after the talk, Kahneman responded, "That was extraordinary. That was dazzling, and I don't believe a word of it." And after that initial expression of skepticism, Kahneman and Tversky got in a very intense argument. It might have been the only time Tversky lost an argument, and Tversky was delighted to have lost the argument and went around his university saying, "You won't believe what happened. You won't believe what Danny said." And that inaugurated a 12-year research program, which is the foundation for much, far from all, for much of modern behaviorally informed policymaking. What I want to emphasize in this first chapter, which is about humanity, is 6 behavioral biases, which are the foundation for not only nudging, but subsidies and taxes and prohibitions and mandates that we're observing in many nations. And these all come in one or another way from that initial encounter between Kahneman and Tversky, sometimes described as the Big Bang, Kahneman and Tversky's Big Bang. Okay, the first of the 6 is present bias, which suggests that human beings focus very much on today and tomorrow. Next year or next decade is a foreign country. Let's not call it Japan. Let's call it Laterland. And people aren't sure they're ever going to visit Laterland. If people are present biased in the sense that their current health and economic situation really matters, and their future health and economic situation matter not so much, we might have serious problems with respect to, for example, excessive smoking, insufficient saving, insufficient investment in safeguards for one's future self. And this, of course, can affect nations as well as individuals. It helps account for the problem of climate change and the challenge of solving it. Present bias is accompanied by unrealistic optimism. Kahneman and Tversky identified the planning fallacy, by which people think that a project will typically take much less long than it actually does. If you think a project will take a month, probably take 6 weeks to 2 months. If you think it'll take a year, it'll probably take 2 years, maybe 3. And the planning fallacy is a reflection of unrealistic optimism. 90% of drivers have been found to believe that they are safer, better drivers than the average driver. That can't be true, that 90% are better than the average. Smokers have been found to believe that they themselves are less likely to get heart disease and lung cancer than the average non-smoker. They have an accurate sense of the statistical risk. They might even exaggerate the statistical risk, but they think their own personal risk is lower than that of the average. Almost everyone, approximately 100% of people, believe that their sense of humor is better than the average sense of humor. That's because each of us knows what's funny. I won't make a joke at this point. I'll just notice that people are unrealistically optimistic with respect to humor. If people suffer from present bias and unrealistic optimism, the two are a potentially very serious combination, serious in a bad way. that people can be unattuned to the long term and unrealistically optimistic about how things are going to turn out. The third bias, let's call it, is inertia, where inertia is a very powerful force. It's connected with status quo bias. If people have been doing a certain thing for 3 months, let's say, to get them to change it can be very challenging, even if they ought to change it, because the change, as Sheryl Crow, the singer, you know Sheryl Crow, once sang, a change will do you good. It might involve switching energy plans. It might involve change in your educational environment. It might involve change in your teachers. It might involve a change in your city, but inertia is a very powerful force. That helps account for the power of the default rule. We know that people are not only present biased, unrealistically optimistic, and tending toward inertia. We know that people are loss averse. A loss from the status quo tends to be terrible. The brain goes red, not literally, but metaphorically, when thinking of a loss. A gain is good. The brain likes that, but the brain tends to like a gain significantly less than it dislikes a loss, which suggests that if something is framed as a loss from the status quo, you can get more behavioral change than if something is framed as a gain from the status quo, even if the magnitude is the same. Here's a little data supporting the power of loss aversion. If people are told if you bring your own bag to the convenience store and don't borrow one from the store, you'll get a little money, just a little money. People don't change at all. They think it's only a little money. Why should I bring my own bag? But then if people are told if you use the store's bag, you have to pay a little bit of money, very little, but a little, people then start bringing their own bag or not using bags, because even a small loss activates and discourages the human mind. People are loss averse. We know that loss aversion is accompanied by a heuristic for assessing risk, referred to in the kind introduction. It's called availability bias, which means in thinking whether a risk is going to come to fruition, people ask, can I think of cases in which it came to fruition or not? If you can think of a case in which a risk came to fruition, you might be really scared. It's called availability bias, leading potentially to hysteria. And if people can't think of a case in which a risk came to fruition, they might be complacent. That's also a form of availability bias. Okay, we now have 5 in chapter 1 of this little book of the biases: present bias, optimistic bias, inertia, loss aversion, and availability bias. An organizing idea, which maybe accounts for all 5 and more, is limited attention. And it's no accident, I think, that Kahneman's first book, before he worked with Tversky, is called Attention and Effort. There are a bunch of things happening in the room in which you are right now. There are a bunch of things happening in the room in which I am right now. And I'm paying attention, as I hope you are, to a very small subset of the things that are happening. Limited attention is part of the magic of the human mind. It allows us to conserve our resources by focusing on what we need to focus on and not attending to the things that we don't need to focus on, for which we might not have cognitive resources. Limited attention, recent work suggests, is the parent of the various biases and heuristics. It probably accounts for most and potentially for all of them and helps explain their power. Okay, so the picture we have of humanity, present biased, unrealistically optimistic, loss averse, and limited in attention, is not one that is properly or fairly characterized as irrational. So it's probably good to avoid the term irrational. That's not accurate. It's not very friendly to call our species irrational. We probably wouldn't be where we are. I think you see a fan in the back. That wasn't by design. The fact that it's present is a tribute to limited attention on my own part, but it's kind of a fortunate neglect of the fan. It's not very beautiful, but it's a really good fan I can tell you. And humanity could not devise things like really good fans or the technology from which we're benefiting today if we were irrational. It's best to say we are boundedly rational. Okay, against the backdrop of this conception of humanity, and there might be evolutionary explanations for the biases. If people are present biased, it may be that's pretty good in terms of survival. If you're running from a tiger, it's good to think, I better get safe rather than how are things going to be in 10 years. And if you're unrealistically optimistic, thinking I can outrun a tiger, that probably helps you run faster than if you think you're doomed. So there may be evolutionary explanations for the biases. Okay, now chapter 2, nudges. The basic idea behind nudges, as signaled in the introduction, is that there are things that people can do in their capacity, let's say, as educators or as companies or as governments. There are things that people can do to counteract the adverse effects of behavioral biases or absence of information. I think it's increasingly clear that it's useful to distinguish between two kinds of nudges. And Dick Thaler and I didn't do that in the original edition of the book, but it's pretty fundamental. Some nudges are educative and some nudges are architectural, and they're very different. Let's notice, first and foremost, that a GPS device is a nudge that is both educative and architectural. It's both. And let's notice that a GPS device is instructive about understanding what a nudge is. Thaler and I didn't see this clearly during the first edition of our book, but a GPS device is instructive first because the person who is using it gets to decide where they want to go. So if you want to go to Milan, you tell the GPS device that's where you want to go. You don't want to go to Berlin. So you're in charge of the ultimate destination. Second, with a GPS device, if it gives you a route to get to Milan and you don't like it because it's not pretty enough or not familiar enough, you can say, I reject the nudge that the GPS device is imposing. So it's paternalistic, the GPS device. It tells you what it thinks you should do, but it is freedom preserving in two different senses. First, you are in control of the destination. And second, you get to reject the nudge if you don't like it. I say it's at the intersection between educative and architectural. It is educative in the sense that it tells you something about how to get there, but it also creates a kind of architecture for you that makes things navigable, and it's highly visible on the screen. Typically, nudges are easier to characterize as educative and architectural, or architectural. The distinction is pretty clear. An educative nudge might be a warning. If you swim at this beach, be careful because the current is very strong. Or if you are buying this food and you have an allergy to peanuts or shrimp, you probably shouldn't eat it because it has peanuts or shrimp. That is an educative nudge. If you buy a car and it has a ton of information about, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions or other air pollutants or the economic savings because it's an electric car and you don't have to buy gasoline, that is an educative nudge. If you buy sunscreen because it's summer's coming and it's going to be sunny and there's information about what is necessary to reduce cancer risks and what kinds of sunscreen just help with respect to tanning, that is a nudge. If you buy a refrigerator and it gives you information about the energy efficiency, that is a nudge. If you receive on your phone a text message, that's a phone, a visual display, If you get a text message saying you have a doctor's appointment tomorrow or your bill is due next week, that is a nudge. A reminder is a nudge. If you're informed of the social norm that most people are doing something, that is an educative nudge. These are things that increase your own capacity for agency by giving you information that you might deem relevant, but you might think, I know my doctor's appointment is tomorrow, but I don't really care because I'm really busy and I'm going to cancel it. You're allowed to do that. Or you might think the social norm is, let's say, different from what you do, but you might think that's fine. I'm my own person. I don't want to act consistently with the social norm. I don't care about the social norm. That's fine also. Architectural interventions that take the form of nudges preserve freedom of choice, but they change the background architecture against which people make decisions. So automatic enrollment, let's say in green energy. Switzerland, by the way, has done this, automatic enrollment in green energy, and it's had a big impact. That is an architectural intervention. Germany also has used automatic enrollment in green energy. The one regulation I worked on in the Obama administration that it's hard for me to talk about without crying, I'm going to try to be able to do that without crying. Let's see if it works, involves free school meals for poor children. And the law allows poor children to get free school meals. The question is, how do we get them to sign up? The parents often don't sign up. How do we make that happen? The intervention we did was a nudge by which parents are automatically enrolled in free school lunches. If we know that they're poor, the children automatically get the meals. They can opt out if they don't want to. It's just a nudge. It's not a mandate. If the parents want them to bring their own meals or not to eat, that's fine. But at latest count, over 10 million poor children were benefiting from automatic enrollment in free school meals. And while 10 million is a number, if we put on the screen, let's say 7 of those children, it might be that I at least would have a hard time not crying, thinking that their lives have been materially improved by this nudge. If you make something salient by putting in a large font, making it very clear on a website, organizing a grocery store so that the healthy foods are at front and the less healthy foods are in the back, that is an architectural nudge. If people are told that if you're going to get a driver's license, you have to say whether you want to be an organ donor, that is a nudge. It's forced choosing, and it is not educative. It is architectural. Built into the architecture is a mandatory choice. Mandatory choice is a nudge. It tends to overcome inertia. I think we should be able to see now in Chapter 2 nudges that there's a close connection with Chapter 1 humanity, that educative nudges can overcome limited attention by drawing people's attention to the fact a bill is due next week. If you don't pay it, you're going to pay a late fee. Unrealistic optimism can be countered by a warning telling people that something to which they're allergic is actually in food, or that the calories in food are very high. That can overcome unrealistic optimism. You can counteract present bias through automatic enrollment in a program that might help people's future self. Automatic enrollment in green energy, automatic enrollment in, let's say, a payment program by which they pay their credit card bill every month. If that's automatic, then their own unrealistic optimism, let's say, about their likelihood of payment or about procrastination will be overcome. So for every educative nudge or architectural nudge, there is potentially at least a behavioral bias that is corrected or protected against. I told you I have data about European countries, which is truthful, but actually under-descriptive. I have data from 17 nations. This has been an extensive research project ongoing, with the latest work coming from studies of financial nudges from yesterday, unpublished. And our data suggests that people like both educative and architectural nudges of the kind that governments have adopted or seriously considered in recent years. In fact, the main story across 17 nations is one of continuity across diverse nations, where approval rates tend to be majority. I told you in Europe, Italy is the strongest approver. Actually, worldwide, the strongest approvers are South Korea and China, for reasons we don't fully understand. The lowest approval rates come from Japan and Hungary, where the approval rates tend to be over 50%, but not like 70%, which is in Europe, or 90%, which is in South Korea and China. The big story is one of enthusiastic embrace. People tend to like, in the data that I have, educative nudges more than architectural nudges. I think it's because they think educative nudges promote agency, where architectural nudges don't compromise agency, but they don't promote it. At the same time, people shift to preferring architectural nudges if they learn that architectural nudges are much more effective, as they frequently are. Here's one little data point that I think is full of implications about nudges. It's very small. The data on whether calorie labels alter food choices is actually pretty mixed. It's not clear that people make different choices if they see hamburger, lots of calories, celery, not many calories. The effect seems to be small. In some studies, it's significant, but it's not major. Here's the fun data about architecture and education meeting. If people see the calorie label on the left of the food item, that it has a greater impact. So if they see calories, then cheeseburger, they're more likely to choose a salad than if they see cheeseburger and then calories. It matters where the calorie label is. Is it before the food or after the food? Now, that might seem a puzzling finding. The puzzle tends to diminish if we look at some of the other data in the study, which is for people who read Arabic and Hebrew, who read from right to left, the greater impact of the calorie information comes when it's on the right. On the right, it has a bigger impact. That suggests that salience in the form of architecture and education in the form of the information that you learn are a potent combination. If you see hamburger, you think delicious, hooray, hamburger. Then calories, you think, well, that's not such a good thing, but hamburger. By contrast, if you see calories and then hamburger, you think calories, that's a lot of calories, bad. Then you see hamburger, you think delicious, but you already kind of decided calories bad. And this happens very quickly in the human mind, which suggests we could often use placement and architecture as a way of fortifying educative messages. I should note that notwithstanding the general approval of nudges across nations, there is a kind of implicit embrace of, let's call, humanity's Bill of Rights with respect to nudging. People don't like nudges that are inconsistent with their values and their interests. They don't like nudges that seem to be supporting the nudgers rather than the people who are subject to the nudges, and they don't like being manipulated. So there is an implicit ethical theory that people in diverse nations embrace, which draws boundaries around what nudges are acceptable. If people are automatically enrolled in a program by which they give to their least favorite charity or their least favorite political candidate, or they are defaulted into a particular religious organization, they don't like that. They're suspicious of that. And that's because they think charitable giving is for them, not for a nudger. And it's because religious conviction should be based on some neutral principle, not on automatic enrollment. So there is a Bill of Rights. Okay, that's end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, I promised or threatened, is an acronym called FEAST. And each of these 5 letters is a stream of research. And it helps organize, I think, the last 12 years or so of policy interventions as well as theoretical advances in thinking about behavioral science. The E in the Feast framework is the most powerful. It's the Olympic gold medal winner. It is Usain Bolt of the behavioral science strategies. And E stands for easy. The basic idea is that if you want to change behavior, often it's best to figure out how to make it really simple for people to do the thing that's desired. There's a study involving whether tenants are going to be evicted from their homes because they're not paying. And it turns out that a significant predictor of whether people are going to lose their homes, and this is startling, is whether they live near the courthouse. Pause over that if you would. Why is proximity to the courthouse a significant predictor of whether they're going to lose their homes? It's because if people live near the courthouse, they'll just go to court and they'll say, I'm sorry, I haven't paid. Can we work out a schedule by which I pay? And then they don't get evicted. If they live far from the courthouse and it's hard to get there, then people don't show up and they are evicted from their homes. So too, vaccination rates increase significantly when there is a place, a pharmacy that provides a vaccine proximate to people. If you make something automatic, think of automatic enrollment in a school meal program or automatic enrollment in a health program or automatic enrollment in double-sided printing. If it's automatic, participation rates shoot up, typically by over 20%. If you can't make it automatic, if you make it really easy for people, if you make it simple, you can get a take-up rate, which is often for public programs in the vicinity of 40 to 60%. That's a scandal. Really good programs, often the take-up rate is 40 to 60%. If you can get that simplified, you can increase the rate. The silver medal winner for the Feast framework is S, which refers to social. If people learn the social norm, for example, if doctors learn, is not to prescribe a lot of opioids, they start prescribing fewer opioids. If people learn, the doctors, that antibiotics aren't prescribed as regularly as they had thought, they stop prescribing antibiotics so regularly. Knowledge about the social norm can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's old data. Here's some really cool new data. Suppose you don't have a social norm in line with what you think is desirable, and you're a government or a private entity or a university. It turns out that if there is an emerging norm, if people in Italy are increasingly doing something, that can accelerate the trend. If people learn that people are increasingly, take your pick, recycling, being vegetarian, being kind, being considerate in a certain way, then it tends to speed up the movement toward the new norm. We don't know exactly why this is. It might be that knowledge of the new or emerging norm is like a proof of concept. It might be that it suggests the arc of history and people don't want to be on the wrong side of history. The A in the Feast framework is for attractive. New Zealand has used this to good effect in various contexts, using colorful fonts, pleasing images. The T is for timely. If you give people information about a nudge the night before they're going to make a decision, that's less good. Remember limited attention, that giving it to them when they're about to make the decision. Timing is very important to consider. So we have now easy, attractive, social, and timely. My favorite in the Feast framework is F, and that's for, I hope I'm not scaring you, that's for fun. That's the word, fun. The basic idea is that we've undervalued people's emotional reaction to a nudge. And if people find it fun or delightful, if it makes them smile, then the likelihood that they will respond positively to it increases. And I think this is very important in the context of the environment and health and safety, where some nudges have a kind of stern face and worry behind them and make people feel scared or at risk or sad, and others make people feel hopeful and optimistic, and maybe they laugh a little bit. Here's some data for that. If people learn that vegetables are really healthy, it's a study from Stanford, there's a 14% increase in consumption. If they learn that vegetables are really delicious and tasty, there's a 27% increase in consumption. Amazon sells certain products through frustration-free packaging. Frustration-free packaging. I've learned that this is actually green packaging. There isn't much plastic or wire. It's an environmental initiative, but Amazon probably knows, they run data, that if you market it as green, it's less likely to get uptake than if you market it as frustration-free. And it really is frustration-free. You get the product and you don't have to wade your way through wires and paper. Frustration-free is fun. Pepsi has learned that Diet Pepsi sells well, but Pepsi Max often sells better. They're similar drinks. They're both Pepsi diet version. Pepsi Max makes people smile and think, Max, that's great. And also diet. Diet Pepsi makes people think diet. That's probably a good idea. And also Pepsi. Diet Pepsi is a little like calories first and then food. Pepsi Max is a little like food first and then calories, but it's working in this context in the direction of choice of the diet option. Okay, fun is the neglected territory of behaviorally informed nudging. It's the area where I think we have a great deal to learn by focusing on people's emotional experience of the nudge. Okay, chapter 4, the final chapter. Thank you for your patience. Sludge. Sludge consists of administrative burdens, paperwork requirements, forms you have to fill out, time you have to wait, places you have to go, that is often a kind of friction or a barrier between people and something that can make their lives better. I mentioned that the take-up rate for various products in many nations is 40 to 60%, and that's a scandal. That 40 to 60% is not 90 to 95%, in part because the sludge that people have to navigate their way through is like a wall between people and something that can make their lives go better. I know that in Italy, as in the United States, as in Germany, as in France, as in Norway, as in nations all over the world, all these nations have a lot of sludge, and it would be very good for the sake of humanity to reduce it. The United States has done a sludge audit. We impose 11.6 billion hours in paperwork burdens on people. Pause over that. 11.6 billion hours annually on people. That's a reflection of a sludge audit, meaning an effort to audit the magnitude of paperwork burdens imposed on people. I'd love to know what Italy does. I hope it's a lot smaller than that. You could do it for cities. What does Paris do on the citizens of Paris? What does Berlin do? What does New York do? That 11.6 billion hours includes 177 million from the Department of Transportation, 185 million from 177 from the Department of Labor, 185 from the Department of Transportation, 209 million from the United States Department of Agriculture, 1.4 billion from the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, those are numbers. If people are rational, nurses, truck drivers, the elderly, poor people seeking a benefit, that number might be daunting. But if people suffer from present bias, inertia, unrealistic optimism, the consequence of sludge might be much more severe than anyone intended. I have to introduce now a last concept, which is the concept of scarcity, which is to me the most exciting concept in behavioral economics in the last 10 years. The idea is that each of us has cognitive scarcity. We have economic scarcity as well, and we're mortal, but we have cognitive scarcity, that the number of things we can think about at any time is less than the number of things that it would be in our interest to be able to think about. If people are suffering from poverty, loneliness, hunger, poor health, or old age, or just busyness, the problem of cognitive scarcity is really terrible. If you are poor, the number of things you can think about other than your economic situation is by definition not that high because you're trying to deal with your poverty. If you're suffering from depression or anxiety, then sludge will be really challenging. It might make you more anxious and more depressed. And since many programs are designed to help people who are struggling with poverty or depression or anxiety, it's a kind of ironic cruelty that there's a sludge navigation duty imposed on the very people who are supposed to be benefited. President Biden refers to time taxes. And if you remember any concept from these remarks, I hope it's that one. Time taxes. Sludge imposes time taxes on people, and that is a form of tax which in some ways is even more unwelcome than monetary taxes. Here are two things to do in response to the problem of sludge, two behavioral interventions. The first is sludge audits. Sludge audits everywhere. I think universities should do sludge audits. How much sludge do you all have to face in the course of a month? I hope it's not a lot. Hospitals should be doing sludge audits. I've been involved in a sludge audit with respect to a cancer screening test at a large hospital. And the result is that the sludge that people have to go through to get the cancer screening test is so terrible and so severe that a lot of people give up and they don't get screened for cancer, which means some of them are going to get, really sick. And the reason isn't anything other than the sludge. Hospitals generally should be doing sludge audits. I hope you're thinking of areas where a sludge audit would be doable. I just spoke this morning at the OECD, and all over Europe, the idea of sludge audits is getting traction, and we're seeing them starting. Then we need to do sludge removal. We need to think, where can we reduce time taxes? Because the burden imposed by sludge is not justified by the benefits of sludge. At the Department of Homeland Security, where I work, I'm here in my academic capacity, but I work in our government as well, we've issued a 20 million hour challenge. Pause over that if you would. It's a burden reduction initiative that is designed to insist, really, that of the 190 or so million annual hours we impose, we're going to take 20 million of those hours away. Those might involve processing visas and immigration. They might involve travel within the United States or from Rome to New York. Maybe we'll reduce some of the sludge there. They might involve things that involve licenses and permits and permissions. Maybe we can cut the paperwork burden down. This Department of Homeland Security initiative is part of a network of initiatives throughout the United States government right now towards sludge reduction. And I'll just report parenthetically that my wife, Samantha Power, who runs the United States USAID, which is our development agency, is involved very aggressively in a burden reduction initiative to ensure that people who need development help get it, and they aren't slowed down for years because of administrative burdens, which are just very challenging to get through. Okay, that's Sludge. That's my book. I'm done with the little book I've been privileged to write for you. But some books have an epilogue, and this book does have an epilogue. The short epilogue consists of a single question, which is, what are human beings most blessed to have? If everything we have, what's the most precious? And there are many candidate answers to that question that are reasonable. I suggest that in what I hope is the aftermath of COVID-19, there's one answer that stands above the rest. There's one answer that's better than any of them, and it's a four-letter word. The thing that people are most blessed to have is time. Let's find, shall we, ways to give other members of the human race more of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kes, for this very engaging lecture. You have provided us with much food for discussion, and I'm sure the Q&A session will give us the opportunity to deepen some relevant aspects. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Donato to start the discussion.
Thank you very much, Gus. It's a real pleasure and honor to host you at Pisa University. I believe one of the key successes of Nudge is its challenge to the long-dominant paradigm of neoclassical economics, the Bayesian rationality approach, which posits that we are all economic actors who make rational decisions and to maximize our outcomes. Fortunately, Taylor and yourself have shown that we are subject to cognitive biases and heuristics that affect our judgment, a finding elaborated in the seminal work Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman and Tversky. Nudge offers an effective solution for enhancing decision-making, where regulators act as architects of choice that promote welfare through default rules and offering the best decision-making pathway while still preserving freedom of choice through opt-out rules. Now, we are observing the remarkable success of Nudge in financial markets, where regulators are using the finding of your model to help consumers make better choice with their money. But I wonder if Nudge, when applied by regulators in those markets, without appropriate caveats, such as, for example, transparency, publicity, and accountability, may trigger undesirable outcomes in decision-making environment. And this, I particularly stress this concern in my review of your book, Nudge, the final edition, pointing out that consumers tend to follow suggestive behaviors, even if they are suboptimal, either because of a lack of information or due to an overload of information, and is that impair sound decision-making. Now, Cass, do you think such adverse effect could undermine the opt-in-out rules and maybe freedom of choice as well? And if so, what you suggest regulators do mitigate this risk? Thank you very much in advance, Cass.
Great, I thank you for that. So, as an occasional regulator myself, I think there are a few things to keep in mind. First, if you have an educative nudge, it should be based on sound information, and it should be tested to make sure that people will understand it and respond reasonably to it. So let's suppose that you're trying to protect people against credit card arrangements by which they end up paying a lot of money to the credit card company, to give them clarity about what their relationship to the company is, what the interest rate is, what the late fees are, what the overuse fees are. That's really very, very important. And if the information is accurate, and if people understand it, then it's likely to have significant benefits and not very high costs. So if you learn that you're taking out a loan. And if you stop paying for a few months, you're going to have to pay a lot. That's beneficial. If you don't know the terms, that's terrible. So people should be nudged to know what the terms of their agreement are. If the regulator, let's suppose, is concerned that people are automatically enrolled in things that are bad, like they're automatically enrolled in a program by which they're paying a lot of money every month for nothing. Maybe it's an insurance program that's useless, or maybe it's a fee that they don't really know about. To regulate that by forbidding automatic enrollment is a really good idea if we know that the program is a harmful program. And our Federal Reserve Board has done something exactly like that to ensure that people aren't automatically enrolled in something that is harmful for them. Now, these are nudges that work with architecture or education. If we are, as you say, aware that people aren't fully rational, we might have some mandates and bans to consider. So to forbid companies from imposing certain terms might be a good idea, though we want to make sure there aren't, as you say, unintended side effects. Maybe I'll give you another little note, which is that in my regulatory capacity in my second stint in the government, I was in charge of regulation, including to some extent financial regulation, with an eye toward cost-benefit analysis. And that was something President Obama was very firmly committed to. And the idea is to make sure that the benefits of what's done justify the costs. And that's not just a conclusion. Of course they do. You wouldn't do that. You have to have data that proves it's true. So if we know that a regulation that's a nudge costs very little, and if we know that even if it succeeds only a little bit, it has benefits, then it's probably a good idea. So this is a plea for testing to the extent that you can. And if you have something where you know the costs of the intervention are low, and even if it's less successful than you could possibly imagine, the benefits still justify the costs, then do it. In the financial domain that I'm aware of, the effects of nudges and behavioral informed interventions are extremely impressive. There's a law called the CARD Act, passed in 2010, I think, maybe 2009, which is delivering to consumers over $9 billion in annual benefits, $9 billion, approximately the same in euros. And the people who are benefiting are people who really need the benefit because they don't have good credit ratings. So the benefits are concentrated in vulnerable people.
A very thought-provoking answer. Thanks, Cass. Now let me hand over to Bruno for the next question.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein, for your very interesting lecture. We say that nudge theory aims to make an important contribution to human welfare, considering the limits of human rationality and choice. At the same time, some concerns have been raised in the debate. I recall two of them, drawing from some remarks of Riccardo Viale. First, nudge could interfere with people's fear of ants, although it is conceived as a means paternalism. Second, nudge could affect their decision-making. We know that human beings, despite their limitations and flaws, can change and grow through their own development. In this regard, we stress the importance of enhancing the individual's decision-making, such as with education policies. In our country, the Italian Constitution stipulates as one of the main goals the full development of the human being. This development is not a starting point, but the end of a long pathway. In this path of development, an important role could be played by wrong decisions. errors can be a powerful channel for learning. So, what is the relationship between nudge and the development of the individual in the light of the human evolution? And what features do you think nudge should have to fit properly in such an evolution? Thank you very much.
This is great. This is a great question. So let's distinguish, shall we, between educative nudges and architectural nudges. If you have an educative nudge by which people learn about the features of an automobile, so they learn about the safety ratings, they learn about the environmental impact, they learn about durability of the car through a nudge. So there's a simple label that tells you things, and that nudges you to choose, let's say, an environmentally better or a safer car. But if you want, let's say, a cheaper car that is environmentally worse, you can completely do that. That nudge doesn't compromise, I'm looking the full development of the human being. And while it isn't, the best thing you could imagine to promote the full development of human being, it's a positive on that count. So the educative nudges are consistent with, though the full development of a human being is a pretty fancy word for which the kinds of nudges that we're discussing are modest improvements. If there's an architectural nudge by which, let's say, the computer you're using is by default accompanied by double-sided printing, or if the cell phone which you has a bunch of defaults in it that are, let's say, generally in your interest, but maybe some of them aren't, you can change them. I wouldn't say that that increases or promotes the full development of a human being, but it doesn't compromise the full development of a human being. If you are automatically enrolled in green energy in, let's say, Berlin, you can opt out to coal, let's suppose, if you want, but you're automatically enrolled in solar or wind. That doesn't compromise the full development of the human being. So I'm struggling to think of any case in which the abstract and very important goal of full development of human being is compromised by a nudge. We could maybe think of a hypothetical nudge. What would that nudge be? Something which said, you can't experiment in life unless you opt out of the non-experimentation default. That's kind of a crazy nudge, and it's also hard to think how to operationalize it. I take your point about errors, and we do learn from errors, and that's very important. I think no public official who's worked on nudging has thought it's essential to prevent people from making any errors. But we don't want people to be buying sunscreen thinking that it will prevent cancer or reduce the risk of cancer when it won't, because it's too weak. We don't want people buying food, let's say, that has a lot of calories without knowing that it has a lot of calories. We don't want people getting a plan for healthcare that they don't understand well. And it would be a mistake because it's a terrible plan for them. That's not a good thing. The worst forms of errors lead to catastrophe and death. And people can benefit from catastrophe because they learn. I was hit by a car in 2017. I was almost killed. That was an error. I wasn't as careful as I should have been. Am I glad that I was hit by a car because I'm more careful walking now? No, I would have been preferred. It would have been better if I'd been nudged not to be hit by a car. And for the approximately 40,000 Americans who die every year in road accidents, I don't know how many is in Italy, how many die, but I'm confident it's higher than it should be. They make a mistake, it would be very good to nudge them not to get killed. So I appreciate the question. I'm thinking the appreciation of how we learn from errors. That's like quicksand. in the sense that it's true, but it's an abstraction that can lead us to acceptance of tragedy. And I'd prefer not to accept tragedy.
Excellent. Always something new to learn, I must say. Our next discussant is Tamara. Tamara, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Professor Sunstein, for your insightful speech. In my question, I would like to focus on the chapter Saving the Planet. Since here, to address the climate change, you emphasize the need to combine nudge and traditional incentives, such as green taxes, cap and trade systems, and subsidies. As you mentioned at the beginning of your speech, the European legal system is already implementing policies that are based on such a combination between nudge and incentives, and Italy as well. Indeed, we have some recent regulatory policies that are promoting forms of energy citizenship and also consumer empowerment through partnerships between the public, private, and the third sector. In particular, nudge policies for green energy are implemented not only by transparency, green defaults, smart grid, and smart metering, but also in innovative ways, such as collective self-consumption or energy communities that involve individuals, governments, and non-profit entities. At the same time, we have state aid that promote environmental sustainability, so enriching new forms of collaboration. The final goal is to integrate incentives and nudge, thus promoting also new forms of public-private partnerships at the local level. So in this scenario, my question is, in your opinion, what might be the balance between nudging and traditional incentives to promote environmental sustainability? Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you. So the goal should be to reduce environmental harm at the lowest possible cost. So that's our goal. And if we're thinking of an initiative, let's say it's a nudge or a regulation, it's good to think, what do we get from it and what do we lose from it? Now, if you had a set of subsidies, let's say, that aren't that high, but that promise to reduce greenhouse gas emissions very significantly by moving people, let's say, to cleaner energy and cleaner cars, that's a really good set of subsidies. The challenge is how to get people to take advantage of the subsidies. And it might be that we need nudges to get them to take advantage of the subsidies, because it might be that switching to clean energy is confusing or risky and perceived as that and has sludge in it. So we need nudges to help them. Or it might be that electric cars seem appealing, but people don't know how they're going to charge them. And they need nudges to teach them that. You could have some nations that are challenged to have subsidies and mandates, but are not so challenged to have nudges. And it might be just a political necessity to use nudges. And that could be helpful in the sense that every time you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you produce a benefit. I find a very useful number to be the social cost of carbon. One rough estimate that in Europe and the United States seems, in the ballpark is approximately 150 euro. That's an estimate. Let's not take it as, the right estimate, but as a reasonable estimate. That suggests that every time we reduce a ton of greenhouse gas emissions, we deliver 150 euros in benefits to the world. Now, in thinking whether you have a nudge or some other instrument, we think how many tons do we reduce? If we reduce 1,000, we multiply that times the social cost of carbon, and we get the right number. And then we think, what is the cost of doing the thing? So this is a bit of a stumbling way. Thank you for indulging both my stumbling in response to this great question and also for indulging my language. And I'm grateful that you're speaking this language and willing to listen to me in it. I'd ask in every case, what instrument produces what benefit? Now, it might well be the United States has just issued a proposed regulation of power plants. And it's a regulation, it's not a nudge. The benefits in terms of air pollution are very high, including the benefits in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. The costs aren't low, but the benefits are much higher than the costs. So it's a good idea. Should we accompany with this with nudges? Probably. The nudges, for example, a fuel economy label on motor vehicles, it would be surprising if that they deliver the same magnitude of benefits that you can get from a clean power plant regulation or a mandate for fuel efficient cars, but they probably have net benefits that are significant. So in every case, and this is not something that people march under a banner typically, but in every case, it's good to get very concrete about the magnitude of reductions and the cost of reductions.
Thank you, Cass. Your answer was enlightening. Let's bring in the last discussant for the last question. Invite Nicola to take.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Professor Sunstein, for your speech. I will focus on the second part of the book, where you and Thaler address the topic of choice architecture and introduce the notion of sludge. You said you define sludge as any aspect of choice architecture consisting of friction that make it harder for people to obtain an outcome that will make them better off. Then you distinguish between intentional and unintentional sludge. I wonder if sludge, and particularly unintentional sludge, is inevitable within a complex architecture of choices, and if so, what strategies can be used to mitigate the impact of sludge? From another point of view, we know that public officials should protect the rights of citizens. However, they risk introducing sludge using both mandates and nudges. In such case, what can be the remedies to sludge? Thank you very much.
That's great, thank you. And I'm especially appreciative of you because you are an administrative law specialist, and that's my most beloved field of law also. And sludge is highly relevant to administrative law. Okay, can we maybe use some examples? And I'm sure there are analogs in Italy. To travel in the United States, there's a long line often, a long security line. You can think of that as a form of sludge. It's like a time tax, the line. We introduced something that happens to be called TSA Pre, where you register, you're known to be a safe traveler, and you get a shorter line. It's typically 5 minutes. The reduction of time from 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes to 5 minutes, that's a Christmas present. If you travel internationally, there's something called global entry. And I know in Europe there are wonderful analogs to this, where global entry means you just go to a kiosk. You don't have to deal with people and long lines. You just go to a kiosk. Truck drivers in the United States, at one point, at the end of the day, they had to fill out paperwork to make sure the car's safe. And then at the beginning of the next day, they had to fill out paperwork again. All they did in between the night and the morning was sleep, and they had to fill out the paperwork twice. That was too much sludge. It was taken away. They didn't have to do it twice. Healthcare systems typically burden administrators and doctors and nurses and patients with undue sludge. Now, there needs to be you need to have records of the patient's health, and you need to have records that bear on economic issues and others, but the volume of sludge is typically much too high. I'll tell you a story about healthcare sludge. I was in a group of students at a very distinguished university some years ago, and I asked them about their healthcare and how it was, and they said, it's good. And then two of them said, but for mental health, it's not so good. And one of them said, I suffer from depression. I personally don't. I suffer from depression. This was a student. So they suffer from depression, and said, I was trying to get help, but I had to deal with so much sludge that I was just getting more and more depressed, and I gave up. And she said it with a smile, but it's not good. So every administrative apparatus has to have more than zero sludge to make sure people are actually eligible for the thing they're seeking, or maybe to collect data that can be useful for other programs. But typically the volume of sludge is much higher than it should be. And that's why we need sludge audits.
Well, let me thank again Cass, discussants, and the audience for attending. This has been a very exciting session. The lecture and discussion, I believe, have been very relevant and stimulating. Thanks again. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a great honor. And